George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks. Because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed to be in is you kept your knee on our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks. The reason why we're marching all over the world is we were like George. We couldn't breathe, not because there was something wrong with our lungs, but you wouldn't take your knee off our neck. We don't want no favors. Just get up off of us, and we can be and do whatever we can be.
That's Reverend Al Sharpton preaching as a civil rights leader, delivering the eulogy at yesterday's memorial service for George Floyd in Minneapolis. It was a stirring, a moving address, Willie, where Reverend Sharpton, on behalf of millions of black Americans, said, get your knee off our necks. And, of course, he wasn't just talking about policing. He talked about education. Two Americas when it came to education. Two Americas when it came to health care. Two Americas when it came to policing. And you look at the numbers, and the numbers are stark. Whether you talk about the quality of education that white children get compared to black children, if you talk about health care outcomes, health care coverage that white families get compared to black families, if you look at just society in general, there are two Americas, and this is something that, again, thankfully, we're seeing in the poll that came out this morning, that more white Americans are beginning to understand, certainly when it comes to the issue of policing in black communities.
Yeah, I thought Reverend Sharpton captured exactly the message that a lot of us have been hearing for 2 weeks, and that is that the horrifying death of George Floyd was just the latest incident. And again, yes, about police brutality, yes, in the way police treat and react to African Americans in our society. But as Reverend Sharpton said, this goes back 401 years to 1619, and all the problems and all the knees that have been on the necks, literally and figuratively, of African American people in this country, in all the ways that Reverend Sharpton laid out in his speech and all the ways that you laid out there. And that's what I'm hearing from my friends. That's what I'm hearing in our community discussions, which is that this is not just about George Floyd. He is the catalyst this time, but this is about so much more. It's about systemic racism. It's about the way that white people, even friends, look at each other, look at African American people differently and treat them differently. And hopefully, if we take some good out of this, as Gene Robinson's been saying all morning, this cracks something open in this country where we look at ourselves more deeply and we change. Still with us this morning, we've got Washington anchor for BBC World News America, Katty Kay, and as I mentioned, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, Eugene Robinson. Joining our conversation this hour, columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post, David Ignatius, and senior news correspondent at WBUR Boston and an MSNBC contributor, Kimberly Atkins. A new ABC Ipsos poll asked Americans, do you approve or disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling the response to the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis? 32% say they approve, 66% disapprove. The poll also found 74% of Americans feel George Floyd's death was a, quote, sign of broader problems in the treatment of African Americans by police. 26% feel it was an isolated incident. As for the other major issue facing the country, the president's approval rating for his handling of the coronavirus remains at 39%, 60% disapprove. So, Joe, This is kind of what we've been getting at this morning, which is that 74% of Americans see something in the death of George Floyd, in the killing of George Floyd, that is much bigger than police violence, that it is about the way African Americans are viewed and treated in this country and have been for a long time.
You know, and Kimberly, what is so dramatic is a change just between 2014 and now. 74% of Americans see this as a broader problem, as this ABC poll shows this morning, for policing in black communities. Just 6 years ago, 5 years ago, I think it is, in Ferguson, 60% of white Americans did not think it was a broader problem, thought it was an isolated incident. It seems these last 10 days have dramatically changed the attitudes of millions and millions of Americans.
Yeah, it's the last 10 days. I think it's also the ensuing years where we have seen so many instances of black people dying, unarmed black people dying at the hands of police, or people acting as if they were police. That is part of that change. And we've seen the change reflected within the last 10 days. These protests may have been very different if they were just people of color, if they were just black people protesting in black communities. That is not what we've seen. We have seen a broad array of people from different, geographically diverse, ethnically diverse, racially diverse, economically diverse people who have been speaking out against this injustice. We've seen protests take place all over the world. So clearly there has been a sea change here. I think a lot of reasons for that. There's been a lot of education about what is going on. The work of community members never stopped, even if it wasn't making the headlines, and trying to get people to understand what is happening. You see more buy-ins from police departments. We've seen more police chiefs speaking out and saying that they understand that the pain that people are feeling. They understand the injustice. They too felt the trauma when they saw George Floyd being killed in the street. So will it make for permanent changes in policy? That remains to be seen, because we have seen over and over again, there is outrage, then that outrage fades and nothing changes. But at least at this moment in time, it has the nation's attention, and it has the much broader support than we have seen at any other previous time.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.